There are words that don't break you in the moment you hear them, but in the moment you realize he truly means them. You accidentally heard your husband say that he doesn't find you attractive anymore. Not during a fight, not in the heat of emotion, but calmly, casually. And in that moment what appears inside isn't anger, it's emptiness. And one frightening question: what do you do now with this relationship? And what do you do with yourself? If you're replaying those words over and over right now, not knowing whether to talk to him, or stay silent, change yourself, or shut down, stay. Here you'll understand what actually helps in this situation, and why the first thing you want to do almost always makes it worse. After you heard it, something inside you seemed to shut down. Not immediately, not loudly. At some point you just caught yourself staring at one spot, not understanding what you were feeling. It doesn't feel like ordinary hurt, and it doesn't feel like anger. It feels as if you were quietly crossed out. You keep living, making coffee, answering the kids, going to work, smiling at people you know. But inside a strange feeling appears, as if you're no longer in your place. You replay what you heard again and again, not because you want to torture yourself, but because your mind is trying to understand what to do with it now. And almost always the first thought sounds like this: maybe there really is something wrong with me? This is a very dangerous moment, because this is exactly where a woman slowly turns the blow inward. You look at your reflection longer than usual. You notice things you never paid attention to before. You compare yourself to other women, even if you never used to do that. But the issue isn't the mirror, not your age, not your appearance. The real pain is somewhere else. You suddenly realize that the person you expected warmth and acceptance from no longer sees you as a value. And this doesn't just damage self-esteem, it destroys the sense of safety, because attractiveness in marriage isn't about the body. It's about the feeling. I am desired here. Exactly here. By him. When that feeling disappears, you start to feel lonely next to a living person. And then something happens that almost no one notices right away. You become quieter, more cautious. You talk less about how you feel. You ask for less. You expect less. Not because you're weak, but because fear appears inside. What if I hear something again that I'm not ready for? You start adapting even without realizing it. You change your tone. You smooth out the edges. You keep important words to yourself. And gradually distance appears between you. Not because of fights, but because of silence. The most insidious part of this situation is that it doesn't look like a crisis. You may not argue, not yell, not talk about divorce. On the outside everything looks normal, but inside you're left alone with what you heard. And here it's important to say something you may not have been told. Backhand index pointing right: what you're feeling right now is normal. You're not dramatizing. You're not too sensitive. You're responding to a loss of support. Because hearing something like that is the same as realizing, I am no longer safe in this relationship. And until you regain that inner sense of safety, any conversation with him will either hurt more or be useless. That's why right now you don't need to urgently confront him, demand explanations, prove your worth. Because in this state you're not protecting yourself. You're only exposing even more vulnerable places. First, you need to understand what exactly was wounded inside you. Not for him, for yourself. And next we'll talk not about how to become attractive, but about how to stop losing yourself at this point. After you hear this, an almost automatic thought appears. He says this because I've stopped being attractive. This is the fastest and most painful interpretation, because it directs the blow straight at you. But the truth is that in most cases, words like this don't start with appearance. They start much earlier, in the place where something in the relationship stopped being alive a long time ago. When a man speaks about a woman this way, he is rarely talking about her body. He is speaking from disconnection, from habit, from emotional laziness, sometimes from inner irritation that he himself doesn't recognize. This is important to understand because otherwise you fall into a trap. You start thinking that if you change your appearance, lose weight, become softer, more convenient, more interesting, everything will come back. But the problem is not how you look. The problem is that the connection between you has been broken for a long time, and instead of dealing with that, he devalues you. There is an uncomfortable truth that is rarely said out loud. Devaluation is a way to distance yourself without taking responsibility. When a person does not want or does not know how to be close, it is easier for him to reduce the value of the other than to admit his own emptiness or helplessness. That's why such words almost never sound honest or direct. They are not said in a conversation, not as an attempt to fix something. They are said casually, as if it doesn't matter at all, as if you are just background, but it matters to you, because you are invested in this relationship. And here another trap appears. You start comparing yourself to other women, to those he looks at, to images from social media that have nothing to do with real intimacy. And every time you lose, because comparison is a game where the rules are stacked against you from the start. It's important to understand this. Attractiveness in marriage is not a visual parameter. It is a reflection of connection. When there is contact, interest, warmth between you, even a tired woman remains desirable. When there is no connection, even the most perfect appearance stops meaning anything. So his words are not a verdict on you. They are a symptom that something between you has not been working for a long time. And if you now start proving yourself, justifying yourself, urgently changing, you only further reinforce the role of the one who chases approval. And that destroys respect even more. Your task right now is not to figure out what is wrong with you. It is to see the place where the relationship stopped being alive. As long as you perceive his words as an evaluation of you, you lose your position. But the moment you start seeing this as a problem of the relationship dynamic, not of your value, you gain solid ground under your feet. And next we will talk about the most dangerous step that almost everyone takes after this, and that makes the situation worse even though it seems logical. After you heard it and lived through the first wave of pain, the next stage begins almost unnoticed. It's the most dangerous one, because from the outside it looks like, I'm pulling myself together. You wake up in the morning and decide you can't fall apart. You have to live. You have to be normal. You have to hold it together. And this is where the first decision appears, one that seems logical. Don't show how much it hurts. You decide not to talk, not to bring it up, not to ask questions, because inside there's fear. What if you hear something even worse? You start behaving more carefully, smoothing your tone, watching your words, complaining less, asking for less, being too much less. This isn't a conscious choice. It's a protective reaction. It's like you're telling yourself, if I become quieter, calmer, more convenient, the pain won't get worse. But the opposite happens. The less you show what's going on inside you, the more emptiness grows between you. The next step is even more dangerous. You start changing yourself. Not because you want to, but because you hope. You catch yourself thinking, maybe if I look different, maybe if I were lighter, maybe if I stopped being tired. And this is where a woman begins to slowly lose herself. Not immediately, not dramatically, but step by step. You stop relying on your own feeling of this hurts, and you start relying on his reaction. Did he like it or not? Did he notice or not? Did he say something or stay silent? And this is the moment when the balance in the relationship shifts completely. Because when one side starts adapting, and the other changes nothing, the connection stops being equal. It's very important to understand. In that moment you are not saving the relationship. You are saving the feeling that you haven't been rejected completely. And here another trap appears, the straight-on conversation. Many women think, I'll just talk to him calmly. I'll say it hurts. He'll understand. But a conversation from a place of broken inner support almost never works. Because you come not from a position, but from hope. Not from clarity, but from expectation. And if you hear coldness in response, devaluation, or irritation, the pain becomes several times stronger. So it's important to say this directly. The most destructive thing you can do is try to earn back what should be given by default. Attraction, warmth, respect. When you start proving your worth, you are already placing yourself lower. And he feels it, even if he doesn't realize it. That doesn't mean you're bad. It means you've been holding on too tightly to a bond that has stopped holding you. At this point you don't need to try even harder. You need to stop. Not to destroy, but to stop being destroyed. Because while you live in the mode of, I'll fix everything now, you don't see the main thing. You are alone inside this relationship. And next we'll talk about what is really behind his words, and why this almost never gets solved through external changes or the right conversations. After the first shock passes and you stop looking for the cause in yourself, the next question appears, the hardest and the most frightening one. Why does he think this at all? Not in the sense of what exactly doesn't he like about me, but in the sense of what is happening to a person who allows himself to devalue someone who is next to him every single day. And here it's important to say right away, in most cases this is not about honesty, and not about courage, and not about him finally telling the truth. It's about detachment. When a man stops feeling connection, he stops feeling responsibility for his words. He speaks as if there is no longer a space of us between you. Very often behind such phrases there is not disgust, but emotional emptiness, habit, the feeling that the relationship already exists and no longer needs effort. At this point in his perception, the woman stops being a living person and turns into background, into part of everyday life, into something taken for granted, and then he allows himself to say things he would never have said at the beginning of the relationship, not because he became more honest, but because he became less attentive. Sometimes there is anger behind this, but not anger at you, anger at his own dissatisfaction with life, at fatigue, at the feeling of being stuck. And instead of dealing with himself, he releases that tension downward, to a place where it feels safe, where there will be no consequences. This is very important to see, because otherwise you keep asking the wrong question. You ask, why doesn't he like me? Instead of, why does he allow himself to speak to me this way? This is a fundamental difference. When a person devalues, he does it not because the other person isn't good enough, but because inside him the connection is broken. With himself, with the relationship, with reality. And there is one more dangerous moment here. If you start explaining his behavior to yourself by saying, he's just having a hard time. He's tired. He's under stress. You take responsibility onto yourself again. It's as if you're saying, I need to be more patient, more understanding, softer. But patience without boundaries is not love. It's self-erasure. It's important to see this. A person who values you, even in a crisis, tries not to destroy the other. And a person who allows himself to humiliate has already taken an internal step away from closeness. This does not mean everything is over, but it does mean that ignoring this is dangerous. Because if you continue living as if nothing happened, you agree to a new norm, one where your sense of worth is no longer taken into account. And next we'll talk about what you can do when you clearly see this reality, but are not yet ready for drastic decisions. After you begin to clearly see reality, a strange feeling appears. On one hand, it feels lighter. On the other, it feels scarier. Because while you were living in doubt, you still had hope. Hope that it was a misunderstanding, that you misunderstood, that everything could be explained. Clarity takes illusions away. And it is exactly at this moment that women most often make one of two mistakes. Either they start enduring again, or they try to solve everything abruptly. But real strength is not born in either of those places. Part 5 is the moment when for the first time you stop living in the mode of, I have to do something to make things better. You begin asking a different question. What is happening to me when I keep living like this? This is a crucial shift. Because before, your focus was on him, on his state, on his words, on his reactions. Now, for the first time, you turn your attention toward yourself. Not out of selfishness, but out of emotional survival. You begin to notice how much tension there is in your life, how often you tense up, how rarely you feel calm around him. And here an uncomfortable truth appears. You have been living in a state of constant internal readiness for a long time. Readiness to be hurt, readiness to hear something unpleasant, readiness for your sense of worth to be threatened again. This is exhausting. Slowly, quietly, but deeply. And that is why reclaiming your position does not begin with a conversation. It begins with the moment. You stop ignoring your own state. You allow yourself to admit, I feel bad. Not because I am weak, but because I have been strong for too long. In a place where it was destroying me. This is the moment when you stop justifying his behavior with circumstances, with stress, with fatigue, with personality. You no longer look for explanations that hurt you, but allow him to change nothing. You also stop justifying yourself. Stop looking for where you didn't try hard enough. Stop thinking that if you were different, this wouldn't have happened. Part 5 is the point where a woman tells herself the truth for the first time, without punishing herself for it. The truth that she can no longer live in a relationship where her value is constantly in question. And it's important to emphasize, reclaiming your position is not coldness. It is not emotional shutdown. It is not a game. It is an internal decision. I will no longer pay with myself for someone else's comfort. You begin to feel boundaries differently, not as a wall, but as a line you can no longer cross. If you want to remain whole, you allow yourself not to explain everything, not to smooth things over, not to be convenient, not because you want to punish, but because you want to preserve yourself. And in this moment, a new inner support appears. Very quiet, very calm. You no longer live waiting for, will he say something good today? Will he like me today? Will I be enough today? You begin to feel that your sense of self no longer has to depend on his gaze. And this does not make you cold. It makes you grounded. Part 5 is not about final decisions. It is about the point where you stop disappearing for the sake of the relationship and begin to be present in your own life again. And only from this state can you move to the next step, not from fear, not from pain, but from clarity and self-respect. After you regain your inner support and stop disappearing inside the relationship, the most difficult and most mature question arises. How do you live Dalshire when the reality has already been seen? But there are no quick solutions. Part 6 is not about making a life-changing decision here and now, and not about putting someone in front of a fact. It is about life after awareness, about how not to slide back into the old state, where you tolerate, explain, and wait. Because after clarity, silence always comes. And in that silence, it is very easy to start doubting yourself again. You may catch yourself thinking, maybe I exaggerated. Maybe he didn't mean it that way. Maybe I'm just too sensitive. This is not weakness. It is a habit of living in adaptation. That is why it is so important to understand. Clarity is not an emotional high that you have to constantly maintain. It is a new inner position that needs to be protected. Part 6 is about preserving yourself. When no one applauds your changes, when the man may continue behaving the same way, when externally it seems like nothing has changed, but inside everything changes. You no longer measure your worth by his attention. You no longer evaluate yourself through his gaze. You no longer check every step with the question, how will he perceive this? You begin to live based on your own sense of what is right and wrong. You allow yourself to feel distance without filling it with excuses. You allow yourself silence without being afraid of it. You allow yourself not to smooth the edges, to preserve the illusion of calm. And this feels very unfamiliar, because before you lived in a state of constant control. Control of emotions, control of words, control of the atmosphere. Now you are gradually leaving that mode. And instead of control, presence appears. You are present in your life, in your sensations, in your reactions. You no longer try to correctly explain your pain so that it will finally be understood. You no longer explain the obvious. You no longer prove that you should not be treated this way. You simply stop participating in it. And this is where many people confuse clarity with coldness. But it is not coldness. It is self-respect. You do not become harsh. You become grounded. You do not stop feeling. You stop destroying yourself. And it is important to say this honestly. This state does not guarantee that the man will change. He may remain the same. He may continue not to hear. He may not notice your inner changes at all. But the difference is this. You no longer live in anticipation of his reaction. You no longer postpone yourself until better times. You no longer live with the thought, if he changes, then I will. You begin to live now. You build your life in a way that makes room for your dignity, for your calm, for your wholeness. Even if the relationship remains difficult, even if the future is still unclear. Part 6 is not the end of the story. It is an exit from the closed circle, from the circle where you constantly prove, endure, hope, and get disappointed again. You leave this circle not through conflict, and not through ultimatums, but through an inner decision. I will no longer live against myself. And when this decision becomes your support, the next steps stop being frightening, because you are no longer taking them from emptiness. You are taking them from clarity. And this is the most important thing you can give back to yourself.